A woman in the audience stood up. She said one sentence. And Johnny Carson put down his microphone and couldn't finish his monologue. It was March 1977. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B in Burbank. Tuesday night. The audience was laughing at Johnny's opening monologue, something about politics, delivered with his signature timing. Ed McMahon was chuckling beside him. Doc Severinsen and the band were ready for the musical cue. Everything was exactly as it should be. Johnny was mid-joke when he noticed her. A woman in the fourth row. Maybe 50 years old. She wasn't laughing. She was staring at him with an intensity that cut through the 300 other people in the studio. Her hands were gripping the armrests of her seat so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Johnny faltered for half a second, barely noticeable to the audience, but enough that Ed glanced at him with concern. Johnny recovered, finished the joke. The audience laughed. He moved to the next card. But his eyes kept drifting back to the woman in the fourth row. She stood up. Not the excited standing of someone trying to get attention. Not the enthusiastic standing of a superfan. This was different. Deliberate. Her whole body trembling with the effort of it. The audience members around her noticed. A few turned to look. The laughter began to fade unevenly across the studio as people sensed something was wrong. Johnny stopped talking mid-sentence. His hand holding the cue card lowered slowly to the desk. "Ma'am?" he said, his voice carrying through the studio. "Are you all right?" The woman's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but it carried in the sudden silence. "Mr. Carson," she said, "my son is dying. And you're the only person who can help him." Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. The control room erupted. Director Bobby Quinn was shouting into his headset. "What's happening? Did someone faint? Do we cut to commercial? Somebody tell me what's going on." Producer Fred DeCordova stood behind Bobby, staring at the monitors. On screen, Johnny Carson stood behind his desk, his cue cards forgotten, staring at a woman in his audience who had just said something impossible to ignore. "Keep rolling," Fred said quietly. "Don't you dare cut away." Johnny set his microphone down on the desk. Not the casual setting aside he did during commercial breaks. This was careful, deliberate, the gesture of someone who knew he was stepping outside the script and didn't care. He walked out from behind his desk. The audience gasped. Johnny never left his desk during monologues. Never. The desk was his kingdom, his safe space, the barrier between host and chaos. But Johnny walked past the desk, past the guest chair, right up to the edge of the stage where it met the audience seating. He was maybe 10 feet from the woman now, looking up at her. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Helen," the woman said, tears streaming down her face now. "Helen Morrison. From Portland, Oregon." "Helen, why don't you tell me about your son?" Helen's legs seemed to give out slightly and she sat back down, but she kept talking, her voice stronger now. "His name is David. He's 17 years old. He has leukemia. Stage 4. The doctors say." She stopped, composing herself. "They say he has maybe 3 months." The studio was completely silent. 300 people holding their breath. The cameras stayed locked on Johnny and Helen. Ed McMahon had stood up from his desk, his jovial expression gone, replaced by something raw and concerned. "I'm so sorry," Johnny said. And the way he said it, not the practiced sympathy of a television host but genuine grief, made it clear he meant it. "David loves your show," Helen continued. "Every night, no matter how sick he feels, no matter how much pain he's in from the treatments, he watches you. You make him laugh. She wiped her eyes. "You're the only thing that still makes him happy." Johnny's jaw tightened. His hands went into his pockets, the gesture he used when he needed to steady himself. "I saved for 2 years to afford tickets to come here tonight," Helen said. "I mortgaged our house. I know that sounds crazy but I had to do something. I couldn't just watch my son die without trying. And I thought. Her voice broke. I thought if I could just talk to you, if I could just ask you. Ask me what, Helen? Would you visit him? Before he. She couldn't finish the sentence. Would you come see David? I know you don't do that. I know you probably can't. But he talks about you like your family. Like you're someone who understands him. And I just thought maybe. Where is he right now? Johnny interrupted. Helen blinked, surprised by the question. He's at Oregon Health Sciences University. The cancer ward. He wanted to come tonight, but the doctors wouldn't allow it. He's too weak. Johnny turned and looked back at his desk. At Ed, who was standing there with tears in his eyes. At the band, silent and watching. At the cameras that were broadcasting this moment to millions of people across America. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Fred, Johnny said, speaking to the control room through the camera, knowing his producer was listening. Clear my schedule for tomorrow. All of it. The control room went silent. Fred de Cordova sat down heavily in his chair. On stage, Johnny looked back at Helen. I'll come see David tomorrow. Give my staff your contact information during the commercial break and we'll arrange everything. Helen's hand flew to her mouth. You'll come? Really? Really? The audience exploded. Not in the excited applause of entertainment, but in something deeper, relief, joy, the sound of 300 people witnessing goodness in action. Helen was sobbing, her hands covering her face. The people sitting around her were crying too, reaching out to touch her shoulder, to share in her moment. Johnny walked back to his desk. He picked up his microphone but didn't raise it to his mouth. Instead, he looked directly into camera one. Folks, he said, his voice thick with emotion, we're going to take a commercial break. And when we come back, well, I think we're going to have a different kind of show tonight. The show went to commercial. During the break, Helen gave her information to a production assistant. Johnny sat at his desk, his head in his hands, Ed's hand on his shoulder. Doc Severinsen came down from the bandstand to check on him. You okay, Johnny? Doc asked quietly. Johnny looked up. His eyes were red. I have 3 sons, document. If one of them was dying and watching a late-night show was the only thing that made them smile, I'd do exactly what that woman just did. To understand what happened next, you need to understand something about Johnny Carson that most people didn't know. Johnny wasn't just a television host. He was a man who had seen death up close and personal. His son Richard had died in a car accident in 1991. But even before that tragedy, Johnny had lost his father to a heart attack, had watched friends die from cancer, had sat in hospital rooms holding the hands of people he loved while they slipped away. He rarely talked about it publicly. Johnny's whole persona was built on being light, funny, the man who made America laugh before bed. But privately, death haunted him. It made him understand that every moment mattered, that kindness wasn't something you scheduled, it was something you did right now because tomorrow might not come. The next morning, Johnny Carson got on a plane to Portland. No cameras. No publicity. He told his publicist not to inform the press. This wasn't for ratings or image. This was for a 17-year-old boy named David Morrison who loved The Tonight Show. Helen met him at the hospital. She looked like she hadn't slept, her eyes swollen from crying, but this time from hope instead of despair. He doesn't know you're coming, she whispered as they walked down the corridor of the cancer ward. I didn't tell him. I was afraid. I was afraid something would happen and you wouldn't be able to make it, and I couldn't bear to disappoint him. I'm here, Johnny said simply. Let's not make him wait any longer. David Morrison's room was at the end of the hall. Small. Sterile. The walls covered with posters, Star Wars, Led Zeppelin, and 3 different Tonight Show promotional photos that David had carefully cut from TV Guide magazines. David was in bed, thin beyond belief, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. and 4 ran into his arm. Monitors beeped quietly beside him. But when Johnny walked through that door, David's eyes went wide and his entire face transformed. "Mom," David said, his voice hoarse. "I'm hallucinating again. The medication is making me see." "You're not hallucinating, David," Johnny said, walking to the bedside. "I'm really here." David stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then he started crying. Not sad crying. The overwhelmed crying of someone who can't believe what they're seeing. Johnny sat down in the chair beside the bed. He stayed for 3 hours. They talked about everything. David's favorite Tonight Show moments. Johnny's favorite guests. David's dreams of being a writer someday. Johnny's early days in radio. They didn't talk about cancer. They didn't talk about dying. They just talked like 2 people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Before Johnny left, he pulled something from his pocket. A blue cue card, one of the cards he used for his monologues, with a joke written in his own handwriting. "This was going to be in last night's show," Johnny said, handing it to David. "But I never got to it because your mom stood up and said something that mattered more than any joke I could tell. I want you to have it." David held the card with trembling hands, staring at Johnny's handwriting like it was a holy text. "When you watch the show," Johnny continued, "and you see me holding these cards, I want you to remember that you have one too. You're part of the show now, David. You're part of the family." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny visited David 3 more times over the next 2 months. Each time unannounced to the press. Each time bringing a new cue card with a joke written just for David. On Johnny's 4th visit, David was barely conscious. The cancer had spread. The end was close. Johnny sat beside the bed anyway. He held David's hand. And he told jokes, quietly, gently, the same jokes he would tell on television that night. David couldn't respond, but his fingers squeezed Johnny's hand weakly, and Helen swore she saw her son smile. David Morrison died on May 15, 1977. He was holding Johnny Carson's cue cards in his hands. Johnny didn't find out until 2 days later. Helen called the studio. She spoke to Fred de Cordova because she couldn't bring herself to tell Johnny directly. Fred called Johnny at home. Johnny listened in silence, thanked Fred for telling him, and hung up. That night's Tonight Show opening monologue was different. Johnny walked out to his usual applause. He sat behind his desk. He picked up his cue cards, and then he set them down again. "I need to tell you about someone," Johnny said to the camera, his voice steady but his eyes glistening. "His name was David Morrison. He was 17 years old. He died 2 days ago. And he taught me something important about why we do this show." The audience went completely silent. "David loved to laugh," Johnny continued. "Even when he was in pain. Even when the world was unfair and cruel and taking everything from him. He found joy in the small things. In a joke. In a conversation. In knowing that somewhere out there, people cared about him." Johnny paused, collecting himself. "A few months ago, David's mother stood up in this audience and asked me to visit her son. And I did. Not because I'm some kind of hero, I'm not. But because when someone asks for help, you help. It's that simple." Johnny reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a blue cue card. The last one he'd given to David. "David's mother gave this back to me yesterday. She said David was holding it when he died. And she wanted me to have it because..." His voice cracked. "Because David told her it proved that someone cared." He held the card up to the camera briefly, then placed it in his desk drawer. "I'm keeping this here. Where I can see it every night. To remember that this show isn't just about jokes. It's about showing up for people when it matters." But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny looked directly at the audience. If any of you are going through something impossible right now, if you're watching someone you love suffer, if you feel alone, you're not. Someone out there cares. I promise you that. The audience stood. applauding through tears. Ed McMahon couldn't speak. Doc's trumpet played softly, a gentle, mournful melody. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. That cue card stayed in Johnny's desk until his final show in 1992. After he retired, he donated it to a children's hospital in Portland with a note. For the kids who need to laugh when the world is hard. Helen Morrison sent Johnny a letter every year on David's birthday until Johnny died in 2005. He answered every single one.